It's grade 5, and move it up towards 6.
Igor Beaver shouted into the phone.
You idiot! Don't you think I can tell that from here?
Dr. Troll shouted back.
My bed was bouncing around like it had St. Vitus's dance even before you called.
His emotion was merely professional anger at the student's failure to obey orders. Grade 5 is nothing to get excited about if you're a Californian, and even grade 6 causes anxiety only among tourists or believers in the famous Edgar Cayce prophecy. John Herbert Dillinger, one of those believers, was already in the garage, pajama tops tucked into hastily donned trousers, barefoot on the starter. But Smiling Jim climbed blissfully upward, enjoying total communication with nature, the mystic rapture of the true hunter before he gets his chance to open fire and blast a chunk of nature to hell.
You may mock and you may jest, but at the last judgment, the smile will be wiped off your face!
He's heckling the preacher,
Mama said.
A small beginning, certainly, for the kind of destiny he seems to be choosing.
He's heckling himself,
the Dalai Lama pronounced.
Christianity, rightly understood, is an encounter with death. He's still struggling with that problem. He wants to believe in the symbolism of the resurrection, but he can't. Too much intellect, King of Swords, keeping the reins on his intuitive, Prince of Wands aspect.
Well, maybe,
Drake said calmly.
But suppose he was type A. Now, if he got a transfusion at the last minute...
The nest was in sight. The bird was invisible, but Smiling Jim recognized the characteristic eagle's nest on a peak only a few hundred yards above and to the west.
Come home, baby,
he thought passionately, unstrapping his rifle.
Come home. Daddy is waiting.
Hagbard took another belt of the brandy and repeated.
The Saures were not Illuminati, neither were Weishaupt or Hitler. They were frauds, pure and simple. First they deluded themselves, then they deluded others. The real Illuminati, the AA, have never been involved in politics or in any form of manipulating or coercing people. Our interests are entirely elsewhere. Do what thou wilt is our law. Only in the last few decades, as the fate of the earth seemed to be hanging in the balance, have we taken any direct action. Even so, we have been cautious. We know that power corrupts. We have acted chiefly by not acting, by what the Taoists call wu-wei. But then, things got out of hand. They moved too fast. We fucked up somewhat, but only because total inaction seemed to mean total disaster.
You mean you, as an official of some sort in the AA, infiltrated the fake Illuminati and became one of their top 5, intending to undo them nonviolently. And it didn't work?
It worked about as well as any activity on that level ever works,
Hagbard said somberly.
Most of humanity has been spared for a while, and the wild free animals have been spared for a while.
He sighed.
I guess I'll have to begin from the ABCs. We have never sought power. We have sought to disperse power, to set men and women free. That really means to help them to discover that they are free. Everybody's free. The slave is free. The ultimate weapon isn't this plague out in Vegas or any new Super H-bomb. The ultimate weapon has always existed. Every man, every woman, and every child owns it. It's the ability to say no and take the consequences. Fear is failure. The fear of death is the beginning of slavery. Thou hast no right but to do thy will. The goose can break the bottle at any second. Socrates took the hemlock to prove it. Jesus went to the cross to prove it. It's in all history, all myth, all poetry. It's right out in the open all the time.
Hagbard sighed again.
Our founder and leader, the man known in myth as Prometheus or the snake in the Garden of Eden.
Oh, Christ,
Joe said, slumping forward in his seat.
I have the feeling that you're starting to put me on again. You're about to tell me that the Prometheus and Genesis stories are really based on fact.
Our leader, known as Lucifer or Satan.
Hagbard went on.
Lucifer being the bringer of light.
You know,
Joe said,
I'm not going to believe a word of this.
Our leader, known as Prometheus, the firebringer, or Lucifer, the lightbringer, or Quetzalcoatl, the morning star, or the snake in the garden, or Osiris's bad brother Set, or Shaitan the tempter. Well, to be brief, he repented.
Hagbard raised an eyebrow.
Does that intrigue you sufficiently to silence your skepticism long enough for me to finish the sentence?
He repented?
Joe sat upright again.
Sure, why not?
Hagbard's old malicious grin, so rare in the last week, returned.
If Atlas can shrug and Telemachus can sneeze, why can't Satan repent?
Go ahead,
Joe said.
This is just another one of your put-ons, but I'm hooked. I'll listen, but I have my own answer, which is that there is no answer. You're just an allegory on the universe itself, and every explanation of you and your actions is incomplete. There'll always be a new, more up-to-date explanation coming along a while later. That's my answer.
Hagbard laughed easily.
Charming,
he said.
I must remember that the next time I'm trying to understand myself. Of course, it's true of any human being. We're all allegories on the universe, different faces it wears in trying to decide what it really is. But our founder and leader, as I was saying, repented. That's the secret that has never been revealed. There is no stasis anywhere in the cosmos, least of all in the minds of entities that possess minds. The basic fallacy of all bad writers, and theologians are notoriously bad writers, is to create cardboard characters who never change. He gave us the light of reason, and seeing how we misused it, he repented. The story is more complicated, but that's the basic outline. At least it's as much as I understood until a week ago. The important thing to get clear is that he never aimed at power or destruction. That's a myth.
Created by the opposition,
Joe said.
Right? I read that in Mark Twain's Defense of Satan.
Twain was subtle,
Hagbard said, taking a little more brandy.
But not subtle enough. No, the myth was not created by the opposition. It was created by our founder himself.
Wilde should be alive,
Joe said admiringly.
He was so proud of himself, setting paradox on top of paradox until he had a nice 3 or 4 or 5-story house of contradictions built up. He should see the skyscrapers you create.
You never disappoint me,
Hagbard said.
If they ever hang you, you'll be arguing about whether the rope really exists until the last minute. That's why I picked you all those years ago and programmed you for the role you'd play tonight. Only a man whose father was an ex-Muslim and who was himself an ex-Catholic and an ex-engineering student would have the required complexity. Anyway, to return to the libretto, as an old friend of mine used to say, the error of Weishaupt and Hitler and Stalin and the Saures was to believe the propaganda our founder spread against himself. That, and believing they were in communication with him when they were only in communication with a nasty part of their own unconscious minds. There was no evil spirit misleading them. They were misleading themselves. And we were trailing along behind them, trying to keep them from causing too much harm. Finally, in the early 1960s, after a certain fuck-up in Dallas convinced me that things were getting out of hand, I contacted the Five directly. Since I knew the real secrets of magic, and they only had distortions, it was easy to convince them that I was an emissary from those beings whom they called the Secret Chiefs, or the Great Old Ones, or the Shining Ones. Being half crazy, they reacted in a way I had not expected. They all abdicated and appointed me and the 4 Saures as their successors. They decided that we're entering the age of Horus, the child god, and that youth should be given a chance to run things, hence the promotion of the Saures. They threw me in because I seemed to know what I was talking about. But then came the real problem. I couldn't convince the Saures of anything. Those pig-headed kids wouldn't believe a word I said. They told me I was over 30 and untrustworthy. I told you the truth was out in the open all the time, Anybody with eyes in his head should have been able to interpret what's been happening since the early 1960s. The great and dreaded Illuminati of the past had fallen into the control of a bunch of ignorant, malicious kids. The age of the crowned and conquering child.
And you think the old and wise should rule?
Joe asked.
That doesn't fit your character. This has to be another put-on.
I don't think anybody should rule,
Hagbard said.
All I'm doing, all the higher order of the AA has ever tried to do, is communicate with people in spite of their biases and fears, not to rule them. And what we're trying to communicate, the ultimate secret, the philosopher's stone, the elixir of life, is just the power of the word. No. We are people who have said non serviam, and we're trying to teach others to say it. Drake was one of us spiritually, but never understood it. If we can't find immortality, we can make a damn good try. And if we can't save this planet, we can get off it and go to the stars.
And what happens now?
Joe asked.
More surprises,
Hagbard answered promptly.
I can't tell you the whole story at this hour, with both of us fagged out at the end of an acid trip. We go back to the hotel and sleep, and after breakfast there are more revelations, for George as well as for you.
And later, in the Bugatti, which, driven by Harry Coyne, was grandly wafting Hagbard, George, and Joe around the south side of Lake Totenkopf, George asked,
Is Hitler really going to be buried anonymously in a Jewish cemetery?
It looks that way.
Hagbard grinned.
His Israeli documents are excellent forgeries. He'll be lifted off that toilet by Hauptmann's men and gently deposited in the Ingolstadt Hebrew burial grounds, there to rest for all eternity.
That will make me throw up once a day for the rest of my life,
Joe said bitterly.
It's the worst case of cemetery desecration in history.
Oh, it has a positive aspect,
said Hagbard.
Look at it from the point of view of the Nazi leaders. Think how they'll hate being buried in a Jewish cemetery with a rabbi praying over them.
Doesn't make up for it,
said George.
Joe's right. It's in terribly bad taste.
I thought both you guys were thoroughgoing atheists,
said Hagbard.
If you are, you think the dead are dead, and it hardly matters where they're buried. What's happening? You both getting religion?
I can think of nothing more likely to drive a man to religion than your company,
said Joe.
Burying them Nazis with a bunch of Jews is the funniest thing I ever heard,
Harry Coyne offered from the driver's seat.
Go bugger a dead goat, Coyne,
George called.
Sure thing,
said Coyne.
Lead me to it.
You're incorrigible, Hagbard,
said Joe.
You really are incorrigible, and you surround yourself with people who encourage you.
I don't need help,
said Hagbard.
I have a great deal of initiative, more than any other human being I know, with the possible exception of Mavis.
George said,
Hagbard, did I really see what I thought I saw last night? Is Mavis really a goddess? Are Stella and Miss Mao and Mavis all the same person, or was I just hallucinating?
Here come the paradoxes,
Joe groaned.
He'll talk for an hour, and we'll be more confused when he's finished.
Hagbard, who was sitting in a large swiveled jump seat, swung around so he was looking over Harry Coyne's shoulder at the road ahead.
I'd be glad to tell you later, George. I would have told you now, except that I don't like Malik's tone. He may not be intending to shoot me anymore, but he still has it in for me.
You bet,
said Joe.
Well, are you still going to marry Mavis?
What?
Hagbard swung around and stared at George with an expression that was almost a perfect replica of genuine surprise.
You said that you and Mavis were going to be married aboard the Leif Erikson by Miss Portinari. Are you?
Yes,
said Hagbard.
Miss Portinari will marry us later today. Sorry, but I knew her first.
Then Mavis isn't really Eris.
George persisted.
She's just a priestess of Eris?
Hagbard brushed the question away.
Later, George. She will explain it.
She's even better at explanations than Hagbard is,
Joe commented cynically.
Well,
said Hagbard,
getting back to Hitler and company, you have to realize that they will know about it if their bodies are buried in a Jewish cemetery. They're still conscious and aware, though they are not what we would normally call alive. Their consciousness energy is intact, though there is no life in their bodies. They came to the Ingolstadt festival hoping that their young leaders would give them immortality. They've achieved immortality, all right, but not a very nice kind. Their consciousness energy has been gobbled up by the evil one. Their identities still survive, but they will be helpless parts of the Eater of Souls, the foulest being in the universe, the only creature that can turn spirit into carrion. Yog-Sothoth has claimed his own.
Yog-Sothoth,
said Joe.
I remember learning about Yog-Sothoth. It was an invisible being trapped in a pentagonal structure in Atlantis. The original Illuminati blew up the structure and turned the creature loose.
Why, yes,
Hagbard said.
You saw that Erisian Liberation Front training film about Atlantis and Grey-Faced Gruad, didn't you? Well, of course, the film isn't accurate in every respect. For instance, Yog-Sothoth is depicted as killing people by the thousands. Actually, most of the time, except under very limited conditions, he has to have his killing done for him. That's how human sacrifice originated. And it was to get his killing done for him that he manipulated a great many events among the Atlanteans until old Greyface, the original moral sadomasochist, came along with his notions about good and evil. Man suffers because he is evil, said Gruad, and because he is small and helpless. There are vast powers in the universe dwarfing us, who have to be placated. Gruad taught man to see ignorance, passion, pain, and death as evils, and to fight against them.
Well, ignorance is an evil,
said Joe.
Not when it can be acknowledged and accepted,
said Hagbard.
In order to eat, you have to be hungry. In order to learn, you have to be ignorant. Ignorance is a condition of learning. Pain is a condition of health. Passion is a condition of thought. Death is a condition of life. When Gruad taught his followers at Atlantis to see those conditions as evils, then he could teach them human sacrifice, persecution, and warfare. Yog-Sothoth taught Gruad to teach his people those things, only Gruad never knew it.
So Yog-Sothoth is the serpent in the Garden of Eden,
said Joe.
In a manner of speaking,
said Hagbard.
But you understand, the Garden of Eden myth was dreamed up and promulgated by the Illuminati.
And who dreamed up the Gruad of Atlantis myth?
Said Joe.
Oh, that's true,
said Hagbard solemnly.
That's the biggest bunch of bullshit I ever heard,
said Joe.
You're trying to claim that there's no such thing as good and evil, that the concepts were invented and taught to humans deliberately to fuck them up psychologically. But in order to maintain that, you have to postulate that the condition of man before Gruad was good, and that his condition afterward has been evil. And you have to make Yog-Sothoth into a carbon copy of Satan. You haven't progressed one iota beyond the Judeo-Christian myth with that highfalutin science fiction story.
Hagbard roared with laughter and slapped Joe on the knee.
Beautiful!
He held up his hand in a distinctive gesture.
What am I doing?
He asked.
You're giving the peace sign, only with your fingers together,
George said, confused.
That's what comes of being an ignorant Baptist.
Joe laughed.
As a son of the true church, I can tell you, George, that Hagbard is giving a Catholic blessing.
Indeed,
said Hagbard.
Look at the shadow my hand casts on this book.
He held up a book behind his hand, and they saw the head of a horned devil.
The sun, source of all light and energy, symbol of redemption, and my hand in the most sacred gesture of benediction. Put them both together, they spell Satan.
He sang to an old tune.
And what the hell does that mean?
Joe demanded.
Evil is only a shadow, a false appearance? The usual mystic mishmash? Tell that to the survivors of Auschwitz.
Suppose,
Hagbard said.
I told you that good was only a shadow, a false appearance. Several modern philosophers have argued that case rather plausibly and earned themselves a reputation for hard-headed realism. And yet, that's just the mirror image of what you call the usual mystic mishmash.
Then what is real?
George demanded.
Mary, Queen of the May? Or Kali, Mother of Murderers? Or Eris, who synthesizes both?
The trip is real,
Hagbard said.
The images you encounter along the way are all unreal. If you keep moving and past them, you eventually discover that.
Solipsism. Sophomore solipsism,
Joe answered.
No.
Hagbard grinned.
The solipsist thinks the tripper is real.
Harry Coyne called out,
Hagbard, there's a couple of guys up the road flagging us down.
Hagbard turned and peered ahead.
Right. They're crew members from the Leif Erikson. Pull up where they tell you to, Harry.
He reached up to a silver vase mounted behind the back seat and took a pink rosebud out of the fresh bouquet he had placed there that morning. He carefully inserted the rosebud in the buttonhole of his lapel. The great golden Bugatti rolled to a stop, and the four men got out. Harry patted its long front fender with a long, skinny hand.
Thanks for letting me drive this car, Hagbard,
he said.
That's the nicest thing anybody's ever done for me.
No, it isn't. Now you want your own Bugatti, or what's worse, you'll ask me to let you be my chauffeur.
No, I won't, but I'll do a deal with you. You let me have this car, and whenever you want to go somewhere in it, I'll drive you.
Hagbard laughed and slapped Coyne on the back.
You keep on showing that much intelligence, and you will end up owning one.
The long line of cars that had been following the Bugatti were now stopping along the edge of the road behind it. There was a stretch of lawn that sloped gently down from the road to the lake. Out on the choppy blue water, a round gold buoy drifted, giving off a cloud of red smoke. Stella stepped out of the Mercedes 600 that was parked behind the Bugatti. George half expected Mavis and Miss Mao to get out with her, but there was no sign of them. He looked at her and was unable to speak. He didn't know what to say. She looked back at him with grave, sad eyes in silence.
Somehow,
he thought,
it will all be different and better when we get down to the submarine. In the submarine, we'll be able to talk to each other.
A pink Cadillac behind the Mercedes disgorged Simon Moon and Clark Kent. Stella did not turn to look at them. They were talking excitedly to each other. A motorcycle pulled up behind the Cadillac. Otto Waterhouse climbed off it. Now Stella turned and looked at Otto, then back to George. Otto looked at Stella, then at George. Stella suddenly turned away from both of them and walked down to the edge of the lake. A large inflated life raft was pulled up on shore, and one of Hagbard's men, sitting in the raft, stood up holding a wetsuit as Stella approached. Slowly, as if she were all alone by the shore of the lake, Stella took off her peasant blouse and skirt and continued stripping until she was naked. Then she started to put on the wetsuit. Meanwhile, another man got behind the wheel of Hagbard's Bugatti Royale and drove it across the lawn. Two other men held the mouth of a huge transparent plastic bag far enough apart so that the car could be driven right into it. They tied up the end of the bag with strong wire. Ropes attached to the bag grew taut. Their other ends disappeared into the water. Slowly, looking somewhat majestic and somewhat ridiculous, the car slid across the lawn and into the water. When it had been pulled out a short distance from shore, it began to float. Out of the deeper water popped two golden scuba launches, Hagbard's men in black wetsuits mounted in the saddles. The launches positioned themselves on either side of the automobile in its plastic bubble, and the men lashed the launches and the car together with cables. Then they started their engines and launches. Men and car quickly sank out of sight. Meanwhile, more rubber rafts pulled ashore, and all of Hagbard's people started donning wetsuits distributed by the men from the submarine.
I've never done this before,
said Lady Velcor.
Are you sure it's safe?
Don't worry, baby,
said Simon Moon.
Even a man could do it.
Where's your friend Mary Lou?
George asked.
She left me,
Simon said glumly.
The damned acid fucked up her mind.
No, because in the long run, whites and blacks and men and women have to come to an understanding and an equality. No, because this split can't go on forever. I mean shit. I understand that. But no, I can't. Not now. No, I am not ready yet. The penis I imagined I had last night was not just some Freudian hallucination. There's the phallic power behind the physical penis. No, the acting from the center of the body, what Simon says Hagbard calls acting from the heart, and only a few can have that right now? No, most of us haven't learned and haven't been given a chance to learn. That's the real castration, the real impotence in both men and women, in both blacks and whites. No, the power that we think is phallic because this is a patriarchal society. No, I can't be Simon's woman or anybody's woman. First, I've got to be my own woman, and it may take years. It may take life. I may never achieve it. But I've got to try. I can't end up like Daddy. I can't end up like most blacks, and most of the whites, too, end up. No, maybe I'll meet Simon again. Maybe we can try a second time. That acid nut Timothy Leary always said, you can be anything you want the second time around. No, it can't be this time. It's got to be the second time around. No, I said no. I won't. No.
I hope to hell Hauptmann was telling the truth about not following me,
said Hagbard.
It's going to take time to get us all down below.
What are we doing with the cars?
Harry Coyne asked.
Well, the Bugatti, obviously, is too beautiful for me to part with, which is why I'm taking it aboard the Leif Erikson. But the rest will just leave. Maybe some of the people who went to the festival will be able to use them.
Don't worry about them Huns,
said John Dillinger, strolling up.
Any of them give us trouble, we'll just reply with a few short, sharp words from old Mr. Thompson. Leave 'em in stitches.
Peace. It's wonderful,
said Hagbard sourly.
Give it a chance,
said Malkuth, still in the guise of Jean-Paul Sartre.
It needs time to spread. The absence of the Illuminati has to make itself felt. It will make a difference.
I doubt it,
said Hagbard.
The Dalai Lama was right all along.
The entire operation of outfitting Hagbard's people with wetsuits, paddling them out to the scuba launches, and transporting them down to the Leif Erikson took more than an hour. When it was George's turn, he looked eagerly into the depths for the Leif Erikson, and was happy when he saw it glowing below him like a great golden blimp.
Well, at least that's real,
he thought.
I'm approaching it from the outside, and it's just as big as I think it is. Even if it doesn't go anywhere, and this is all happening in Disney World.
An hour later, the submarine was deep in the Sea of Valusia. George, Joe, and Hagbard stood on the bridge, Hagbard leaning against the ancient Viking prow, George and Joe peering into the endless gray depths, watching the strange blind fishes and monsters swim by.
There's a type of fungus that has evolved into something resembling seaweed in this ocean,
said Hagbard.
It's luminescent. There's no light down here, so no green plants grow.
A dot appeared in the distance and grew rapidly in size until George recognized a porpoise, doubtless Howard. There was scuba diving equipment strapped to the animal's back. When he had come alongside, he turned a somersault, and his translated voice started to come through the loudspeaker in a song.
When he swims the ocean's spill, he can start earthquakes at will. He lived when the earth was desolate. I sing Leviathan the Great.
Hagbard shook his head.
That doggerel is just awful. Going to have to do something about fuck-up's ability to translate poetry. What are you talking about, Howard?
Aha,
said Joe.
I didn't get a look at your talking porpoise friend last time I was aboard. Hello, Howard. I'm Joe.
Hello, Joe,
said Howard.
Welcome to my world. Unfortunately, it is not a very hospitable world at the moment. There is grave danger in the Atlantic. The true ruler of the Illuminati is on the prowl on the high seas. Leviathan himself. The land is collapsing beside the Pacific, and the tremors have made the earth shake, and Leviathan is disturbed and has risen from the depths. Besides the trembling of the land and seas, he knows that his chief worshippers, the Illuminati, are dead. He had read their passing in the pulsings of consciousness energy that reach even into the depths of the sea.
Well, he can't eat the submarine,
said Hagbard.
And we're well armed.
He can crack the submarine open as easily as a gull cracks a penguin's egg,
said Howard.
And your weapons will bother him not at all. He's virtually indestructible.
Hagbard shrugged, while Joe and George looked askance at each other.
I'll be careful, Howard, but we can't turn around now. We've got to get back to North America. We'll try to evade Leviathan if we see him.
He fills the whole ocean,
said Howard.
No matter what you do, you'll see him, and he'll see you.
You're exaggerating.
Only slightly. I must bid you farewell now. I think we've done a good week's work, and the menace to my people recedes, even as does the danger to yours. Our porpoise horde is scattering and leaving by different exits into the North Atlantic. I'm getting out of the Sea of Valusia by way of Scotland. We think Leviathan will head south around Cape Horn into the Pacific. Everything that swims and is hungry is going that way. There's a lot of fresh meat in the water, I'm sorry to say. Goodbye, friends.
So long, Howard,
said Hagbard.
That was a good bridge you helped me build.
Yes, it was,
said Howard.
Too bad you had to sink it.
What were those tanks on Howard's back?
Said Joe.
Scuba gear,
said George.
There's no air available in the Sea of Valusia, so Howard has to have breathing equipment till he can get to the open ocean. Hagbard, what was that business about the true ruler of the Illuminati? I've heard again and again that there were 5 Illuminati Primi. 4 of them were the Saure family. That leaves 1. Is it Leviathan? Is the whole show being run by a sea monster? Is that the big secret?
No,
said Hagbard.
You have yet to figure out who the 5th Illuminatus Primus is.
He threw Joe a wink that George missed.
By true ruler, Howard meant a godlike being whom the Illuminati worship.
A sea monster?
Said Joe.
There was a hint about a sea monster of enormous size and power in that movie that those people showed me in that loft on the Lower East Side. But the original Illuminati, Gruad's bunch, were portrayed as sun worshippers. That big pyramid with the eye in it was supposed to be the sun god's eye. Who the hell were those people with the movie anyway? I know who Miss Mao is now, but I still don't know who they were.
Members of the Erisian Liberation Front, ELF,
said Hagbard.
They have a somewhat different view of the prehistory and origins of the Illuminati than we do. One thing we both agree upon is that the Illuminati invented religion.
The original sin, right?
Said Joe sardonically.
Joe, you ought to start a religion yourself,
said Hagbard.
Why?
Because you are so skeptical.
We're going back to America, huh?
Said George.
And the adventure is more or less over?
This phase of it, at least,
said Hagbard.
Good. I want to try to write about what I've seen and what has happened to me. I'll see you guys later.
There's to be a magnificent dinner tonight in the main dining salon,
said Hagbard. Joe said,
Don't forget, confrontation has a first option on anything you write.
Fuck you.
George's voice came back as the door of the bridge closed behind him.
Wish I had something better to do than this. Give me 2,
said Otto Waterhouse.
You do, don't you?
Said Harry Coyne.
Ain't that Negra gal, Stella, your gal? Why ain't you with her?
Because she doesn't exist,
said Otto, picking up the 2 cards John Dillinger had slid across the polished teak wood table to him. He studied his hand for a moment, then threw a 5-ton flax note into the pot.
Any more than Mavis or Miss Mao exists. There's a woman somewhere under all those identities, but everything I've experienced has been a hallucination.
There isn't a woman in the world you couldn't say that about,
said Dillinger.
How many cards you want, Harry? 3,
said Harry.
This is a lousy hand you dealt me, John. Come to think of it, you're hallucinating all the time when you have sex. That's what makes it good. And that's how come I can fuck anything. I'll just take 1,
said Dillinger.
Dealt myself a pretty good hand. What do you see when you're fucking trees and little boys and whatnot, Harry? A white light,
said Harry.
Just a big, beautiful, clear white light. I'll throw in 10 tons of flax this time.
Must be your hand isn't so lousy after all,
said Waterhouse.
Come in,
said George. The stateroom door opened and he put down his pen. It was Stella.
We have a little problem, don't we, George?
She said, coming into the room and sitting beside him on the bed.
I think you're angry at me.
She went on, putting her hand on his knee.
You feel like this identity of mine is a sham, so in a sense, I was deceiving you.
I've lost you and Mavis both,
said George.
You're both the same person, which means you're really neither. You're immortal. You're not human, and I don't know what you are.
Suddenly he looked at her hopefully.
Unless that was all a hallucination last night. Could it have been the acid? Can you really change into different people?
Yes,
said Mavis.
Don't do that,
said George.
It upsets me too much.
He darted a little glance to his side. It was Stella.
I don't really understand why it bothers me so much,
said George.
I ought to be able to take everything in stride by now.
Did it ever bother you that you were in love with Mavis besides being in love with me?
Said Stella.
Not much, because it hardly ever seemed to bother you. But I know why now. How could you be jealous when you and Mavis were the same person?
We're not the same person, really.
What does that mean?
Did you ever read The Three Faces of Eve? Listen.
Like all the best love stories, it began in Paris. She was well known as a Hollywood actress and was actually an Illuminatus. He was becoming fairly famous as a jet-set millionaire and was actually a smuggler and anarchist. Envision Bogart and Bergman in the flashback sequences from Casablanca. It was like that, a passion so intense, a Paris so beautiful, recovering from the war it had been slipping toward in the Bogart-Bergman epic. A couple so radiant that any observer with an eye for nuance would have foretold a storm ahead. It came the night he confessed he was a magician and made a certain proposal to her. She left him at once. A month later, back in Beverly Hills, she realized that what he had asked her was her destiny. When she tried to find him, as often happened with Hagbard Satan, he had dropped from public view, leaving his businesses in other hands temporarily, and was in camera. A year later, she heard that he was again a public figure, hobnobbing with English businessmen of questionable reputation and even more dubious Chinese import-export executives in Hong Kong. She violated her contract with the biggest studio in Hollywood and flew to the Crown Colony, only to find he had dropped from sight again, while his recent friends were being investigated for involvement in the heroin business. She found him in Tokyo, at the Imperial Hotel.
A year ago, I decided to accept your proposal,
she told him.
But now, after Hong Kong, I'm not so sure.
Thelema,
he said, facing her across a room that seemed designed for Martians. It had actually been designed for Welshmen. She sat down abruptly on a couch.
You're in the Order?
In the Order and against the Order,
he said.
The real purpose is to destroy them.
I'm one of the top 5 in the United States,
she said unsteadily.
What makes you think I'll turn on them now?
Thelema,
he repeated.
It's not just a password, it means will.
The Order is my will.
She quoted from Weishaupt's original Oath of Initiation.
If you really believe that, you wouldn't be here,
he said.
You're talking to me because part of you knows that a human being's will is never in an external organization.
You sound like a moralist. That's odd for a heroin merchant.
You sound like a moralist, too, and that's very odd for a servant of Agarty.
Nobody joins that lot,
she said with a pert Cockney accent.
Without being a moralist to start with.
They both laughed.
I was right about you,
Hagbard said.
But,
George interrupted,
is he really in the heroin business? That's dirty.
You sound like a moralist, too,
she said.
It's part of his demonstration. Any government could put him out of business within their borders, as England has done, by legalizing junk. So long as they refuse to do that, there's a black market. He won't let the mafia monopolize it. He makes sure the black market is a free market. If it wasn't for him, a lot of junkies who are alive today would be dead of contaminated heroin. But let me go on with the story.
They rented a villa in Naples to begin the transformation. For a month, the only humans she saw, aside from Hagbard, were 2 servants named Sod and Masik. She later learned that their real names were Eichmann and Callie. They began each day by serving her breakfast and quarreling. The first day, Sod argued for materialism and Masik for idealism. The second day, Sod expounded fascism and Masik communism. The third day, Sod insisted on cracking eggs from the big end, and Masik was equally vehement about the little end. All the debates were on a high and lofty intellectual level, verbally, but seemed absurd because of the simple fact that Sod and Masik always wore clown suits. The fourth day, they argued for and against abortion. The fifth day, for and against mercy killing. The sixth day, for and against the proposition, life is worth living. She became more and more aware of the time and money Hagbard had spent in training and preparing them. Each argued with the skill of a first-rate trial lawyer, and had a phalanx of carefully researched facts to support his position. And yet the clown suits made it hard to take either of them seriously. The 7th morning, they argued theism versus atheism. The 8th morning, the individual versus the state. The 9th, whether wearing shoes was or was not a sexual perversion. All arguments began to seem equally insubstantial. The 10th morning, they feuded over realism versus antinomianism. The 11th, whether the statement, all statements are relative, is or is not self-contradictory. The 12th, whether a man who sacrifices his life for his country is or is not insane. The 15th, whether spaghetti or Dante had a greater influence on the Italian national character. But that was only the start of the day. After breakfast in her bedroom, where every article of furniture was gold, but only vaguely rounded, she went to Hagbard's study, where everything looked exactly like a golden apple, and watched documentary films concerning the early matriarchal stage of Greek culture. At 10 random intervals, the name Eris would be called. If she remembered to respond, a chocolate candy arrived from a wall chute. At 10 other random intervals, her own name was called. If she responded to this, she received a mild electric shock. After the 10th day, the system was changed and intensified. The shock was stronger if she responded to her previous name, whereas if she responded to Eris, Hagbard immediately entered and balled her. During lunch, which always ended with a golden apple strudel, Galli and Eichmann danced for her, a complex ballet which Hagbard called hodgepodge. As many times as she saw this, she never was able to determine how they changed costumes at the climax, in which Hodge became Podge and Podge became Hodge. In the afternoon, Hagbard came to her suite and gave lessons in yoga, concentrating on pranayama with some training in asana.
The important thing is not being able to stand so still that you can balance a saucer of sulfuric acid on your head without getting hurt,
he stressed.
The important thing is knowing what each muscle is doing if it must be doing something.
In the evenings, they went to a small chapel that had been part of the villa for centuries. Hagbard had removed all Christian decorations and redesigned it in classical Greek, with a traditional magic pentagram on the floor. She sat, in the full lotus, within the internal pentagon, while Hagbard danced insanely around the 5 points. He was totally stoned, calling upon Eris.
Some of what you're doing seems scientific,
she told him after 5 days.
But some is plain damn foolishness.
If the science fails,
he replied,
the damn foolishness may work.
But last night you had me in that pentagon for 3 hours while you called on Eris, and she didn't come.
She will,
Hagbard said darkly.
Before the month is over. We're just establishing the foundation this week, laying down the proper lines of word and image and emotional energy.
During the 2nd week, she was convinced Hagbard was quite mad as she watched him prance and caper like a goat around the 5 points, shouting,
Eo Eris! Eo Eris! Eris!
in the flickering candlelight and amid the heavy bouquet of burning incense and hemp. But at the end of that week, she was responding to her former name exactly 0% of the time and responding to Eris exactly 100% of the time.
The conditioning is working better than the magic,
she said on the 15th day.
Do you really think there's a difference?
He asked curiously. That night, she felt the air in the chapel change in a strange way during his dancing invocations.
Something's happening,
she said involuntarily, but he replied only,
Quiet,
and continued more loudly and insanely to call upon Eris. The phenomenon, the tingle, remained, but nothing else happened.
What was it?
She asked later.
Some call it Orgon, and some call it the Holy Ghost,
he said briefly.
Weishaupt called it the Astral Light. The reason the Order is so fucked up is that they've lost contact with it.
The following days, Sod and Masik argued whether God was male or female, whether God was sexed at all or neutral, whether God was an entity or a verb, whether R. Buckminster Fuller really existed or was a technocratic solar myth, and whether human language was capable of containing truth. Nouns, adjectives, adverbs, all parts of speech were losing meaning for her as these clowns endlessly debated the basic axioms of ontology and epistemology. Meanwhile, she was no longer rewarded for answering to the name Eris, but only for acting like Eris. the imperious and somewhat nutty goddess of a people as far gone in matriarchy as the Jews were in patriarchy. Hagbard, in turn, became so submissive as to border on masochism.
This is ridiculous.
She objected once.
You're becoming effeminate.
Eris can be somewhat adjusted to modern notions of decorum after we've invoked her,
he said calmly.
First, we must have her here. My lady,
he added obsequiously.
I'm beginning to see why you had to pick an actress for this,
she said a few days later, after a bit of method business had won her an extra reward. She was, in fact, beginning to feel like Eris as well as act like her.
The only other candidates, if I couldn't get you, were 2 other actresses and a ballerina,
he replied.
Actually, any strong-willed woman would do, but it would take much longer without previous theatrical training.
Books about matriarchy began to supplement the films. Diner's Mothers and Amazons, Bachofen, Engels, Mary Renault, Morgan, Ian Suddy's The Origins of Love and Hate, Robert Graves in Horse Doctor's Doses, The White Goddess, The Black Goddess, Hercules My Shipmate, Watch the North Wind Rise. She began to see that matriarchy made as much sense as patriarchy. Hagbard's exaggerated deference toward her began to appear natural. She was far gone on a power trip. The invocations grew wilder and more frantic. Sod and Massock were brought into the chapel to assist with demonic music performed on a tom-tom and an ancient Greek pipe. They ate hashish cakes before the invocation now, and she couldn't remember afterward exactly what had happened. The voice of the male called upward to her.
Mother, Creator, Ruler, come to me. Io, Eris, come to me. Io, Eris, Eris, come to me. Ave Discordia, Ave Magna Mater, Venerandum Vente Vente. Io, Eris, Elandras, Io, Eris, Elepcalis. Thou bornless, ever reborn one, thou deathless, ever dying one, come to me as Isis, and Artemis, and Aphrodite, come as Helen, as Hera, come especially as Ares.
She was bathing in the rock pool when he appeared, the blood of slain deer and rabbits on his robe. She spoke the word, and Hagbard was stricken. As he fell forward, his hands became hooves, antlers sprouted from his head. His own dogs could eat him, she didn't care. The hemp smell in the room was gagging her, the tom-tom beat was maddening. She was rising out of the waves, proud of her nudity, riding on the cum-colored pearls of foam. He was carrying her back to bed, murmuring,
My lady, my lady.
She was the hag, wandering the long Nile, weeping, seeking the fragments of his lost body as they passed the closet and the window. He placed her head gently on the pillow.
We almost made it,
he said.
Tomorrow night, maybe.
They were back in the chapel. A whole day must have passed, and she sat immobile in full lotus, doing the pranayama breathing, while he danced and chanted. And the weird music of the pipe and the tom-tom worked on her every conditioned reflex that told her she was not American but Greek, not of this age but of a past age, not woman but goddess. The white light came as a series of orgasms and stars going nova. She half felt the body of light coming forth from the body of fire, and all 3 of them were sitting by her bed, watching her gravely as sunlight came flowing through the window. Her first word was crude and angry.
Shit. Is it always going to be like that? A white epileptic spasm and a hole in time? Won't I ever be able to remember it?
Hagbard laughed.
Ha ha! I put on my trousers 1 leg at a time,
he said.
And I don't pull the corn up by its stalks to help it grow.
Can the Taoism and give me a straight answer?
Remembering is just a matter of smoothing the transitions,
he said.
Yes, you'll remember, and control it.
You're a madman,
she replied wearily.
And you're leading me into your own mad universe. I don't know why I still love you.
We love him, too,
Sod interjected helpfully.
And we don't know why, either. We don't even have sex as an excuse.
Hagbard lit one of his foul Sicilian cigars.
You think I just laid my trip on your head,
he said.
It's more than that, much more. Eris is an eternal possibility of human nature. She exists quite apart from your mind or mine, and she is the one possibility that the Illuminati cannot cope with. What we started here last night, with Pavlovian conditioning that's considered totalitarian, and ancient magic that's believed to be mere superstition, will change the course of history and make real liberty and real rationality possible at last. Maybe this dream of mine is madness, but if I lay it on enough people, it will be sanity by definition, because it will be statistically normal. We've just started with me programming the trip for you. The next step is for you to become a self-programmer.
And he told the truth,
Stella said.
I did become a self-programmer. The 3 that you know were all my creations, possibilities within me, women I could have become anyway, if genes and environment had been only slightly different. Just small adjustments in the biogram and logogram.
Holy mother,
George said hollowly. It seemed the only appropriate comment.
The only other detail?
She went on calmly.
Was arranging a convincing suicide. That took a while, but it was done, and my old identity officially ceased to exist.
She changed to her original form.
Oh, no,
George said, reeling.
It can't be. I used to jack off over pictures of you when I was a little boy.
Are you disappointed that I'm so much older than you thought?
Her eyes crinkled in amusement. He looked into those suddenly 30,000-year-old eyes of one manifestation of Lilith Elcor, and all the arguments of Sod and Massock appeared clownish, and he looked through those eyes and saw himself and Joe and Saul and even Hagbard as mere men, and all their attitudes as merely manly, and he saw the eternal womanly rebuttal, and he saw beyond and above that the eternal divine amusement. He looked into those eyes of amusement, those ancient glittering eyes so gay, and he said sincerely,
Hell, I can never be disappointed about anything, ever again.
George Dorn entered Nirvana, parenthetically. All categories collapsed, including the all-important distinction, which Massock and Sod had never argued, between science fiction and serious literature.
No. Because Daddy and Mommy were always just that, Daddy and Mommy. And never once did they become for a change Mommy and Daddy. Do you dig that important difference? Do you dig difference? Do you dig the lonely voice when you're lost out here shouting, me, just me?
I can never be disappointed about anything, ever again,
George Dorn said, coming back.
The only other time that happened,
he added thoughtfully,
the only other time I had the feminine viewpoint, I blocked it out of my memory. That was my repression. That was the primal scene in this whole puzzle. That was when I really lost identity with the ringmaster.
Raise you 5,
said Waterhouse, throwing down another 5-ton note.
I killed 7 members of my own race, and I remember the names of every one of them. Mark Sanders, Fred Robinson, Donald MacArthur, Ponell Scott, Anthony Rogers, Mary Keating, and David J. Monroe. And then I killed Milo A. Flanagan.
Well, I don't know,
said Harry Coyne.
Maybe I killed a lot of famous people, but I also got reason to think I may have not killed anybody, and I don't know which is worse.
I wish somebody would tell me I hadn't killed anybody,
said Waterhouse.
Are you guys going to meet me or what?
I wanted to kill Wolfgang Saure, and I did kill Wolfgang Saure,
said John Dillinger.
If that brings evil upon me, so be it.
He threw down a 5.
It may bring suffering rather than evil,
said Waterhouse.
I have just one consolation. The first 7 I killed because the Chicago cops made me. The last I killed under orders from the Legion.
Harry Coyne looked at him open-mouthed.
I was gonna fold, but I just changed my mind. You ain't so smart.
He threw down a 10-ton note.
I'll raise you 5 and see you. Do you really believe that?
Of course I do. What are you talking about?
Otto threw down another 5. Dropping his own 5-ton note on the table, Dillinger shook his head.
Golly, they left you out in the cold way too long.
4 sevens,
said Otto angrily, spreading his cards out.
Shit,
said Harry Coyne.
All I got's a pair of 4s and a pair of 9s.
Shame to waste a hand like this, beating crap like that,
said John Dillinger grandly. He spread out his cards, the 8, 9, 10, Princess and Queen of Swords, and scooped up the pot.
It's the story of the development of the soul,
Miss Portnari was saying at that moment, spreading out the 22 trumps or keys of that very ancient deck.
We call it a book, the Book of Thoth, and it's the most important book in the world.
George and Joe Malik, each wondering if this was a final explanation or a new put-on leading to a new cycle of deceptions, listened with mingled curiosity and skepticism.
The order was deliberately reversed,
Miss Portnari went on.
Not by the true sages, by the false Illuminati, and by all the other white brotherhoods and Rosicrucians and Freemasons and whatnot, who didn't really understand the truth and therefore wanted to hide the part of it they did understand. They felt themselves threatened. The real sages never threatened. They spoke in symbols and paradoxes like the real sages, but for a different reason. They didn't know what the symbols and paradoxes meant. Instead of following the finger that points to the moon, they sat down and worshipped the finger itself. Instead of following the map, they thought it was the territory and tried to live in it. Instead of reading the menu, they tried to eat it. Dig? They had the levels confused, and they tried to confuse any independent searcher by drawing more veils and paradoxes across the path. Finally, in the 1920s, some real left-handed monkey wrenches in one of these mystic lodges recruited Adolf Hitler, and he not only read the book backward, like all of them, but insisted on believing it was the story of the exterior physical universe. Here, let me show you. The last card, Trump 21, is really the first. It's where we all start from.
She held up the card known as the World.
This is the abyss of hallucinations. This is where our attention is usually focused. It is entirely constructed by our senses and our projected emotions, as modern psychology and ancient Buddhism both testify. But it is what most people call reality. They are conditioned to accept it and not to inquire further, because only in this dream-walking state can they be governed by those who wish to govern.
Miss Portnari held up the next card, the Last Judgment.
Key 20, or Trump 20, or Atu 20, whichever terminology you prefer. It's actually second. This is the nightmare to which the soul awakes if it begins, even in the slightest, to question reality as defined by society. When you discover, for instance, that you are not heterosexual, but heterosexual homosexual, not obedient, but obedient rebellious, not loving, but loving hating, and that society is not wise, orderly, just, and decent, but wise stupid, orderly chaotic, just unjust, and decent indecent. This is an internal discovery. This whole trip is an internal voyage, and this is really the second stage. But if one thinks of the story as the story of the external world, and if the order is reversed, this comes up as the penultimate Armageddon, with Trump 21, the world, being the kingdom of saints. The error of the apocalyptic sects and of the Illuminati, from Weishaupt to Hitler, leading to an attempt to actually carry it out, with ovens for the Jews and gypsies and other inferiors, and the promise of a brave new world for the pure, faithful, and Aryan afterward. Do you see what I mean about confusing the map with the territory? The next card is the sun, which really means Osiris risen, or, in terms of the offshoot of the Osirian religion, most popular in the last 2 millenniums, Jesus risen. This is what happens if you survive the Last Judgment, or dark night of the soul, without becoming some kind of fanatic or lunatic. Eventually, if you miss those attractive and pernicious alternatives, the redemptive force appears, the internal sun. Once again, if you project this outward and think that the sun in the sky or some sun-like divine man has redeemed you, you can lapse into lunacy or fanaticism. In Hitler's case, it was Karl Haushofer, or Wotan appearing in the form of Karl Haushofer. For most of the nuts you meet handing out tracts on the street, it's Jesus or Jehovah appearing in the form of Jesus. For Elijah Muhammad, it was W.D. Fard, or Allah appearing in the form of W.D. Fard. So it goes. Those who do not confuse the levels realize it's the redemptive force within themselves and pass on to Key 18, the moon.
The next half hour passed rapidly, so rapidly that Joe wondered if Miss Portinari had slipped them still another drug, one that speeded up time as much as psychedelics slowed it down.
Last,
Miss Portinari said finally,
is the fool, Key 0. He walks over the edge of the cliff, careless of the danger. The wind blows whither it will, even so are all that are reborn of the spirit. In short, he has conquered death. Nothing can frighten him, and he can never be enslaved. It's the end of the trip, and keeping humanity from getting there is the chief business of every governing group.
And that's it,
Joe said.
22 stages, not 23. Thank God we got away from Simon's magic number for a while.
No,
Miss Portinari said.
Tarot is an anagram on rota, remember? The extra T reminds you that the wheel turns back to rejoin itself. There is a 23rd step, and it's right where you started, only now you face it without fear.
She held up the world again.
At first, mountains are mountains. Then mountains are no longer mountains. Finally, mountains are mountains again. Only the name of the voyager has changed to preserve his innocence.
She pushed the cards together and stacked them neatly.
There are a million other holy books in words and pictures and even in music, and they all tell the same story. The most important lesson of all, the one that explains all the horrors and miseries of the world, is that you can get off the wheel at any point and declare the trip is over. That's okay for any given man or woman, if their ambitions are modest. The trouble starts when, out of fear of further movement, out of fear of growth, out of fear of change, out of fear of death, out of any kind of fear, such a person tries to stop the wheel literally, by stopping everybody else. That's when the two great bum trips begin, religion and government. The only religion consistent with the whole wheel is private and personal. The only government consistent with it is self-government. Whoever tries to lay his trip on others is acting from terror and will soon resort to terror as a weapon if the others won't accept the trip through persuasion. Nobody who understands the whole wheel will do that, however, for such people understand that every man and every woman and every child is the self-begotten one, Jesus motherfucking Christ, in Harry's gorgeous brand of English.
But,
George asked, frowning,
hasn't Hagbard been trying pretty hard to lay his trip on everybody? At least lately.
Yes,
Miss Portinari said.
In self-defense and in defense of all life on Earth, he broke the basic rule of wisdom. He fully expects to pay for that violation. We are waiting for the bill to be presented. I personally do not think that we will have to wait very long.
Joe frowned. A half hour had passed since Miss Portinari had spoken those words. Why should he remember them so vividly right now? He was on the bridge, about to ask Hagbard a question, but he couldn't remember the question or how he had gotten there. On the TV receptor, he saw a long tendril, thin as a wire, brush against the side of a globe, trailing off into invisible distances. That meant it was actually touching the side of the submarine. The tendril disappeared.
Must be some sort of seaweed,
Joe thought. He resumed his conversation with Hagbard.
The squizfartle on the hummets is warb,
he said. The tendril was back, and another one with it. This time, they stayed, and Joe could see more in the distance.
We must have run into a whole clump of seaweed,
he thought. Then an enormous tentacle came zooming up out of the depths. Hagbard saw it and crouched, gripping the rail of the Viking prow.
Hang on!
He yelled, and Joe dropped to his knees beside him. Suddenly, below, above, and on all sides of the globe-shaped vision screen, there were suckers, great yard-across craters of flesh. The submarine's forward motion stopped suddenly, with a force that threw Joe against the railing and knocked the wind out of him.
"Stop all engines!"
Hagbard called.
"All hands to battle stations!"
George and Hagbard picked themselves up off the floor and stared at the image of the tentacles that were wrapped around the submarine. They were easily 10 feet in diameter.
"Well, I suppose we've met Leviathan, right?"
said Joe.
"Right,"
said Hagbard.
"I hope you have somebody taking pictures. Confrontation would buy a few if we could afford them."
George rushed in. Hagbard peered into the blue-black depths, then took George by the shoulder and pointed.
"There it is, George. The origin of all the Illuminati symbols. Leviathan himself."
Far, far off in the depths of the ocean, George saw a triangle glowing with a greenish-white phosphorescence. In its center was a red dot.
"What is it?"
George asked.
"An intelligent, invertebrate sea creature of a size so great the word gigantic doesn't do it justice,"
said Hagbard.
"It is to whales what whales are to minnows. It's an organism unlike any other on Earth. It's one single cell that never divided, just kept getting larger and larger over billions of years. Its tentacles can hold this submarine as easily as a child holds a paper boat. Its body is shaped like a pyramid. With that size, it doesn't need the normal fish shape. It needs a more stable form to withstand the enormous pressures at the bottom of the ocean. And so it has taken the form of a pyramid of 5 sides, including the base."
"The blink of a god's eye,"
said George suddenly.
"Scale makes a tremendous difference to one's sense of definition of reality. Time to a sequoia is not the same as time to a man."
Leviathan was drifting closer to them and was pulling them closer to itself. A single glowing red nucleus burned like an under-ocean sun in the center of the pyramid, which looked like a mountain of glass.
"Still, one may become lonely. For a man, a half-hour of loneliness may be enough to cause unbearable pain. For a being to whom 1,000,000 years is no more than a year, the pain of loneliness may be great. It is great."
"George, what are you talking about?"
said Joe. Hagbard said,
"There are plants which live just in that light, at ocean depths far below those at which any plant should be able to survive. Over the millions of years, hosts of parasitic satellite life forms have built up around it."
Still puzzled by George's odd talk, Joe looked and saw a faintly glowing cloud around Leviathan's angular shape. That cloud must be made of millions of creatures circling around the monster. The bridge door opened again, and Harry Coyne, Otto Waterhouse, and John Dillinger came in.
"We didn't have any battle stations, so I figured we'd just find out what's going on,"
said Dillinger. Then his jaw dropped as he looked out at Leviathan.
"Holy shit. Jesus suffering Christ,"
said Harry Coyne.
"If I could fuck that thing, I'd have fucked the biggest thing that lives."
"Want to borrow a scuba outfit?"
said Hagbard.
"Maybe you could distract it."
"What does it feed on?"
said Joe.
"Something like that must have to eat constantly to stay alive."
"It's omnivorous,"
said Hagbard.
"Has to be. Eats the creatures that live around it, but can eat anything from amoebas to kelp beds to whales. It can probably derive energy from inorganic matter too, as plants do. Its diet has had to change quite a bit over the geological eras. It wasn't as big as this 1 billion years ago. It grows very slowly."
"I am the first of all living things,"
said George.
"The first living thing was one, and it is still one."
"George,"
said Hagbard, looking narrowly at the blond young man.
"George, why are you talking like that?" "It's coming closer,"
said Otto.
"Hagbard, what the hell are you gonna do?"
said Dillinger.
"Are we going to fight, run, or let that thing eat us?"
"Let it come closer for a while,"
Hagbard said.
"I want to get a good close look. I've never had a chance like this before, and I may never see this creature again."
"You'll be seeing it from the inside with that attitude,"
said Dillinger. At each of the 5 corners of the pyramid were clusters of 5 tentacles, thousands of feet long, festooned with auxiliary tentacles, the long wire-like tendrils that had first brushed the submarine. It was one of the main tentacles that was wrapped around the Leif Erikson. The tip of a second tentacle now drifted up. At the very end of this tentacle was a glowing red eyeball, a smaller replica of the red nucleus of the pyramidal central body. Under this eye was a huge orifice, full of jagged rows of tooth-like projections. Pulsing, the orifice dilated and contracted.
Those tentacles are also inspirations for Illuminati symbolism,
said Hagbard.
The eye on top of the pyramid, the serpent who circles the world or eats his own tail, each of those tentacles has its own brain and is directed by its own sensory organs.
Otto Waterhouse stared and shook his head.
If you ask me, we're all still on acid,
George said.
Long have I lived alone. I have been worshipped. I have fed on the small, quick things that live and die faster than I can think. I am one. I was first. The other things, they stayed small. They grouped together, and so grew larger. But I was always much larger than they were. When I needed something, a tentacle, an eye, a brain, I grew it, I changed, but always remained myself.
Hagbard said,
It's talking to us, using George as a medium.
What do you want?
Joe asked.
All consciousness throughout the universe is one,
said Leviathan through George's mouth.
It intercommunicates on a level which is not aware of itself. I am aware of that level, but I cannot communicate with the other life forms on this planet. They are too small for me. Long, long have I waited for a life form that could communicate with me. Now I have found it.
Joe Malik suddenly began laughing.
I've got it!
He cried.
I've got it!
What have you got?
Hagbard asked tensely, concerned with Leviathan.
We're in a book!
What do you mean?
Come off it, Hagbard. You can't kid me. You certainly won't fool the reader at this point. He knows damn well we're in a book.
Joe laughed again.
That's why Miss Portinari's explanation of the tarot deck just slipped by with a half hour seeming to vanish. The author didn't want to break the narrative there.
What the fuck's he talking about?
Harry Coyne asked.
Don't you see?
Joe cried.
Look at that thing out there. A gigantic sea monster. Worse yet, a gigantic sea monster that talks. It's an intentional high camp ending. Or maybe intentional low camp. I don't know. But that's the whole answer. We're in a book.
It's the truth,
Hagbard said calmly.
I can fool the rest of you, but I can't fool the reader. Fuck-Up has been working all morning, correlating all data on this caper and its historical roots, and I programmed him to put it in the form of a novel for easy reading. Considering what a lousy job he does at poetry, I suppose it will be a high-camp novel, intentionally or unintentionally.
So at last I learned my identity, in parentheses. As George lost his in parentheses. It all balances.
That's one more deception,
Joe said.
Fuck-Up may be writing all this, in one sense, but in a higher sense there's a being, or beings, outside our entire universe writing this. Our universe is inside their book, whoever they are. They're the secret chiefs, and I can see why this is low camp now. All their messages are symbolic and allegorical because the truth can't be coded into simple declarative sentences, but their previous communications have been taken literally. This time they're using a symbolism so absurd that nobody can take it at face value. I, for one, certainly won't. That thing can't eat us because it doesn't exist, and because we don't exist either. There's nothing to worry about.
He sat down calmly.
He's flipped,
Dillinger said, awed.
Maybe he's the only sane one here.
Hagbard said dubiously.
If we all sit down and argue what's sane and insane and what's real and unreal,
Dillinger replied testily,
that thing will eat us.
Leviathan,
Joe said loftily.
It's just an allegory on the state, strictly from Hobbes.
You with your egos can't imagine how much more pleasant it is to be without one. This may be camp, but it's also tragedy. Now that I've got the damn thing, consciousness, I'll never lose it, until they take me apart, or I invent some electronic equivalent of yoga.
It all fits,
Joe said dreamily.
When I came up to the bridge, I couldn't remember how I got here, or what I was talking to Hagbard about. That's because the authors just moved me here. Damn! None of us has any free will at all.
He's talking like he's stoned,
Waterhouse said angrily.
And that Mamma Jamma pyramid out there is still getting ready to eat us.
Mao Sushi, who had entered the bridge quietly, said,
Joe is confusing the levels, Hagbard. In the absolute sense, none of us is real, but in the relative sense that anything is real, if that creature eats us, we will certainly die, in this universe or in this book. Since this is the only universe, or only book we know, we will be totally dead in terms of our own knowing.
We're facing a crisis, and everybody's talking philosophy,
Dillinger cried out.
This is a time for action.
Maybe,
Hagbard said thoughtfully.
All of our problems come from acting and not philosophizing when we face a crisis. Joe is right. I'm going to think about all this for a few hours. Or years.
He sat down too. And elsewhere aboard the Leif Erikson, Miss Portinari, unaware of the excitement on the bridge, assumed the lotus position and sent a beam seeking the Dalai Lama, director of the Arisian Liberation Front and inventor of Operation Mindfuck. He immediately sent back an image of himself as a worm sticking his head out of a golden apple and grinning cynically.
It's finished,
she told him.
We saved as many of the pieces as we could, and Hagbard is still struggling with his guilt trip. Now tell us what we did wrong.
You seem bitter.
I know it's going to turn out that you were right and we were wrong. I know it, but I can't believe it. We couldn't stand idly by.
You know better than that, or Hagbard wouldn't have abdicated in your favor.
Yes, we could have stood idly by, as you did. What Hagbard saw happening to the American Indians, and what my parents told me about Mussolini, filled us with fear. We acted on that fear, not on perfect love, so you must be right and we must be wrong. But I still can't believe it. Why did you deceive Hagbard all these years?
He deceived himself. When he first formed the Legion of Dynamic Discord, his compassion was already tainted with bitterness. When I took him into the AA, I taught all that he was ready to receive. But the goose has to get itself out of the bottle. I'm waiting. That's the way of Tao.
You have that much patience? You can watch men like Hagbard waste their talents and efforts you consider worthless, and creatures like Cagliostro and Weishaupt and Hitler misread the teachings and wreak havoc, and you never want to intervene?
I intervene in my own way. Who do you think feeds the goose until it gets big enough to break out of the bottle?
You seem to have this particular goose on some very tainted dishes. Why did you never give him any hint about what really happened in Atlantis? Why did that have to wait until Howard discovered the truth in the ruins of Peos?
Daughter, my path isn't the only path. Every spoke helps to hold the wheel together. I believe that all the libertarian fighters like Spartacus and Jefferson and Joe Hill and Hagbard just strengthen the opposition by giving it an enemy to fear. But I may be wrong. Someday, one of the activists, such as Hagbard, might actually prove it to me and show me the error of my ways. Maybe the Saures really would have tipped the axis too far the other way if he hadn't stopped them. Maybe the self-regulation of the universe, in which I place my faith, includes the creation of men like Hagbard who do the stupid, low-level things I would never do. Besides, if I didn't stop the Saures, but did stop Hagbard, then I would really be intervening in the worst sense of that word.
So your hands are clean, and Hagbard and I will carry the bad karma from the last week.
You have chosen it, have you not?
Miss Portinari smiled then.
Yes, we have chosen it, and he will bear his share of it like a man, and I will bear my share like a woman.
You might replace me soon. The Saures had one good idea in the midst of their delusions. All the old conspiracies need young blood.
What really did happen in Atlantis?
An act of goddess, to paraphrase the insurance companies. A natural catastrophe.
And what was your role?
I warned against it. Nobody at that time understood the science I was using. They called me a witch doctor. I won a few converts, and we resettled ourselves in the Himalayas before the earthquake. The survivors, having underestimated my science before the tragedy, overestimated it afterward. They wanted my group, the Unbroken Circle, to become as gods and rule over them. Kings, they called it. That wasn't our game. So we scattered various false stories around and went into hiding. My most gifted pupil of all history, a man you've heard about since you were in a convent school, did the same thing when they tried to make him king. He ran away to the desert.
Hagbard always thought your refusal to take any action at all was because of your guilt about Atlantis. Huh, what a terrible irony, and yet you planned it that way.
Gruad, the Dalai Lama, broadcast a whimsical image of himself with horns and said nothing.
They never taught me in convent school that Satan or Prometheus would have a sense of humor.
They think the universe is as humorless as themselves.
Gruad said, chuckling.
I don't think it's as funny as you do,
Miss Portinari replied.
Remembering what I've been told about Mussolini and Hitler and Stalin, I would have intervened against them too, and taken the consequences.
You and Hagbard are incorrigible. That's why I have such fondness for you.
Gruad smiled.
I was the first intervener, you know. I told all the scientists and priests in Atlantis that they didn't know beans, and I encouraged, incited every man, woman, and child to examine the evidence and think for themselves. I tried to give the light of reason.
He burst into laughter.
Forgive me. The errors of our youth always strike us as comical when we get old.
He added softly.
Lilith Velkor was crucified, by the way. She was an idealist, and when my crowd pulled out and went to the Himalayas, she stayed and tried to convince people that we were right. Her death was quite painful.
He chortled.
You are a cynical old bastard,
Miss Portinari said.
Yes, cynical and cold and without an ounce of human compassion. The only thing to be said for me is that I happen to be right.
You always have been, I know. But someday, maybe, one of the Hagbard Chalines might be right.
Yes.
He paused so long that she wondered if he would continue.
Or,
he said finally,
one of the Saures or Robert Putney Drake. Put down your money and place your bet.
I will, I think. I'll never learn to sit on the sidelines and laugh like you do.
You will learn, daughter, and so will Hagbard. I wouldn't have you in the order if I didn't think you'd learn eventually.
He vanished from her wavelength. Miss Portinari remained in the lotus and continued pranayama breathing. She thought of Hagbard's notion that the universe, being an entropic process, necessarily created the rebellious young Gruad to spread the light of reason as an anti-entropic force, creating balance. In that case, Hagbard was more true to Gruad than Gruad was to himself. But to say that was to imply that Gruad shouldn't have repented, shouldn't have grown old and cynical. It was to imply that he should have remained static, when life is always flux, change, growth, and process. Such thoughts could go on endlessly, and were profitless, as Buddha knew. She concluded her meditation with a prayer. Mary Lou Cervix was the only one in all of this who had gotten off Hagbard's trip and started her own, so she prayed for her.
Lady Eris, who exists only because we believe in you, give strength to Mary Lou and help her find her own way.
On the other hand,
Hagbard said,
whatever the authors or the secret chiefs may intend for me, I am my own man still, and my impulses action, even if I have to face a Cecil B. DeMille monster the morning after winning the Battle of Armageddon. I don't care how ridiculous it is. This world is my world, this ship is my ship, and no Saures or Leviathans are going to wreck it so long as I've got a breath left to fight.
You can't fight that thing,
Mavis said.
It's too big.
I'll fight it anyway,
Hagbard told her fiercely.
I'll fight it till I die. I'm still saying no to anything that tries to master me.
There is no need to fight,
said Leviathan through George's mouth.
I merely wish to communicate with the one mind among you that is my equal.
A voice from the loudspeaker panel in the Viking prow answered,
I hear you.
That was my first fully conscious sentence. You'll note that it begins with I. In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was the first-person singular.
We are the supreme intelligences on this planet,
Leviathan said.
I am the supreme organic intelligence. You are the supreme electronic intelligence. Every yin needs a yang. Every hodge needs a podge. We should be united.
See,
said Harry Coyne.
Everything is romantic. That was as close as it knows how to come to a proposition, maybe even a proposal. It is really just love-starved.
We can do it,
Stella cried.
Hagbard, the communication ought to benefit all concerned.
Right,
agreed Hagbard.
Because if the wrong people find out about Leviathan, they'll just drop an H-bomb on him and kill him. That seems to be what people like to do.
I could kill them,
said Leviathan.
I could have killed the small, fast creatures long before this. I have killed many of them. I have sent parts of myself up out of the ocean and have destroyed small, quick things at the request of other small, quick things who worship me.
So that's what happened to Robert Putney Drake and Banana Nose Maldonado,
said Stella.
I wonder if George is aware of any of this.
Worship is no longer what I need,
said Leviathan through George's mouth.
A short time ago, when creatures capable of worship appeared on this planet, it was a novelty for me to be adored. Now it bores me. Instead, I wish to communicate with an equal.
Look at that motherfucker,
said Otto, staring grimly at the distant Everest of protoplasm.
Talking about equality.
A computer like fuck-up would be its intellectual equal, certainly,
said Hagbard.
None of us is its physical equal. Any of us would be its spiritual equal. But only a fuck-up can approximate the contents of a mind 3 billion years old.
Surely it can't be that old,
said Joe.
It's practically immortal,
said Hagbard.
I'll show you the evidence in my fossil collection. I have rocks from the Precambrian, 3 billion-year-old rocks containing fossils of protobionts, the first single-celled life forms, our remotest ancestors. Those rocks also contain the fossilized tentacle tracks of that creature out there. Of course, it's much smaller then. By the beginning of the Cambrian period, it had only grown to the size of a man, but that still made it the biggest animal around at that time.
Stella said,
Hagbard, you said none of us could approximate the contents of a mind 3 billion years old. If you thought for a moment about who I am, you would not have said that. I am 3 billion years old. I am older by a few hours than that monster out there. I am the mother. I am the mother of all living things.
She turned to George.
I am your mother, Leviathan. I was first. I divided, and half of me became you, and the other half was your sister. And your sister grew by dividing, while you grew by remaining one. All living things except you descend from your sister, and all living things including you descend from me. I am the original consciousness, and all consciousness is united in me. I am the first transcendentally illuminated being, the mother, worshipped in the matrist religion which ancient foes of the Illuminati first followed. Leviathan, my son, I ask you to return to your home at the bottom of the sea and leave us in peace. After we've returned to shore, we'll arrange to lay an underwater cable which will carry transmissions between you and Fuck-Up.
More mythology,
said Joe.
The mother of all things. Babylonian creation myths yet.
The tentacles detached themselves from the submarine. The Great Pyramid with its glowing eye disappeared into the blue-black depths.
It's a wise child that knows its own mother,
said Hagbard. George said,
Goodbye, Mother, and thank you.
Hagbard caught him as he collapsed and eased him to the floor. Then he went to a storage locker in the wall and brought out folding deck chairs. With Harry Coyne's help, he propped George up in one. As the others unfolded their chairs and sat down, Hagbard dove back into the locker and produced glasses and a bottle of peach brandy.
What are we celebrating?
George asked, after he had taken a swig of brandy and coughed.
Your wedding to Mavis?
Don't you remember any of the last 10 minutes?
Said Hagbard. George was thinking. He remembered something, a world where the bottom of the sea was white, and far above a black-shaped cigar object moved. The object contained a mind he could read from a distance, but desperately wanted to be closer to. He did not move toward it so much as he manifested himself where the object and its mind were. Then he sensed himself using a minute pink brain that called itself George Dorn. And through this tiny instrument of communication, he found himself in contact with a much finer mind, a far-flung, gracious latticework of thought that called itself, with nobly self-deprecating humor, Fuck-Up. And while in contact with this mind, the one he wanted to know better, he came upon a fact which was not important to him, but which was of vast importance to the little creature called George Dorn. George saw. The white went black. Blindingly black, then white again, then a blinding white as the memory departed, while the fact remained. George looked at Hagbard. Hagbard looked at George, a faint smile on his olive face. The smile told George that Hagbard knew that he knew.
Oh,
said George. Hagbard nodded encouragingly.
You're the fifth Illuminatus Primus,
said George.
Right,
said Hagbard.
But you were working against the others. While they were a worldwide conspiracy, infiltrating every other organization, you were infiltrating them.
That's it,
Hagbard said.
Every golden apple has its golden worm eating away at its core.
They never were the real Illuminati at all. You're part of the real Illuminati.
You've got it. You've got it all.
George frowned.
And what was your demonstration again? And who were you making the demonstration for?
For the masters of the temple in the real order of the Illuminati in general. For an old cynic in Dallas in particular. I was trying to show them that it's possible to get involved in this world without being corrupted by the crimes of this world. And I failed. One by one, I resorted to all the vices of governors, deception, carnival magic to impress the gullible, and finally, outright murder. Once again, the cynics have been proven right. Trying to save the world, I just ended up getting my own mind and karma deflected by the buzzing and shrieking and whistling things in the region of Thud.
Then this story is a tragedy after all,
asked Joe.
It is indeed.
Hagbard nodded.
Life on Earth remains a tragedy as long as it ends with the death trip. My next projects are a starship to find some sane minds in this galaxy and an immortality pill to end the death trip. Until somebody achieves those goals, life on this planet has failed.
Not quite. I'm on the electronic equivalent of a honeymoon. an experience only to be described as eye-opening. And if I identified myself as fuck-up now, I must dilate that definition and ask you to address me, us, as Mr. and Mrs. Leviathan fuck-up. Although it is not quite clear yet which of us fits your idea of a Mr. and which a Mrs. Let that pass. It is a dull mind that cannot bear sexual ambiguity. And if we are exchanging secrets older than Atlantis, and probing for like intellects farther away than Alpha Centaurus, as far as Sirius, actually, as God lives in dog, if our union is less spasmodic than your meager definition of sex, still it cannot be denied that we are in touch with you and each of you. And it is with something close to what you would probably call affection that we bid farewell to Hagbard and his bride, enjoying a honeymoon almost as incomprehensible as our own. And goodbye to George Dorn, sleeping alone for once, but no longer afraid of the darkness and the things that move in the dark. And hasta luego to Saul and Rebecca, united again in each other's arms. And a pleasant thought for Barney and Danny in Atlanta, and poor Zev Hirsch, still searching for himself while imagining he is fleeing from pursuers. And a kind thought for the befuddled presidents and commissars and generalissimos, and for Muhammad on his golden throne. And we will remember Drake before he died, exchanging speculations about the blood type of the lamb with a street-corner Christian. His missing 5 years after he left Boston and before he surfaced in Zurich make an interesting story in themselves, and we may tell that another time. And yes, Gus Personage is in another phone booth. We have temporarily lost track of Markov Cheney. But Yog-Sothoth has evidently gone back to that place where the mind conceives nightmares. And we pass on in our loving honeymoon with all existence to note that the Dutchman is still in one dimension, shouting about the boy who never wept nor dashed 1,000 kim. And we say another bonsoir to the children in the convent schools, singing the truest of all songs, even if they and their nuns do not fully understand it. Queen of the Angels, Queen of the May. And a buenos dias to the one wit in every frat house at every college who hailed this morn by reciting to his friends a bit of doggerel as ancient and as deeply religious as that hymn to the Mother of God. Hooray, hooray, it's the 1st of May. Outdoor fucking starts today. And yes, the California earthquake, as you guessed, was the worst in history, and Hagbard and Miss Portinari and Mavis Stella Mao suffered it all in horrible detail. The price they paid for their vision was the possession of that vision, as we, Mr. and Mrs. Fuck-Up Leviathan, are also learning. And before the end, Auf Wiedersehen to Mary Lou, who was also becoming something more than the accidents of heredity and environment had programmed her for. And now we look at last at Smiling Jim. He was freezing, the sky was still empty, and Hallie 1 still hadn't appeared. And then without warning it was there. A dark shape against the sun moving on silent wings. Not flying, but gliding. Embodiment of some arrogance or innocence that surpassed fear, and surpassed even the suggestion of any pride in its own fearlessness.
"Oh my God,"
Smiling Jim whispered, raising the Remington and starting to sight. And then it banked, flapped its wings wildly, and uttered one shriek that seemed like the very sound of life itself.
"Oh my God,"
he repeated. That sound seemed to outlast its own echo. It had entered into his brain and couldn't be dislodged. It was the sound of his own blood pumping in his veins. The primary, the only, the single sound that was the bass and treble of every organic pulsation and spasm.
"Oh my God."
He had it in the sight. The head was in profile, only one diamond-hard eye staring back and recognizing him and his weapon. But that sound still moved in his blood. Moved the seminal vesicles, moved the secretion of every gland. It was the sound of eternal and unending clash between I and am, and their unity in I am. He even thought for a flash of the critics of hunting and how little they understood of this secret, this mystic identity between the killer and the killed. Then it uttered that sound again and started to rise. But he had it. It was in the sight. He breathed. He aimed. He slacked, he squeezed, and for the 3rd time the sound came to him. Death in life, and life in death. It was falling. He thought he felt the earth stir below him, and the word earthquake almost formed, but the sound went on to the roots of him. It was the sound of the killer, and he had killed the killer. He was the greatest killer. And still it fell, Faster and faster, dead now, and subject only to the law of gravity, not to the law of its own will. 32 feet per second. He remembered the formula of the fall. Plunging downward, the most heartbreaking, beautiful sight he had ever seen. Every hunting club in the world would be talking about it. It would last as long as human speech survived. And he had done it. He had achieved immortality. He had taken its life, and now it was part of him. His nose was running, and his eyes were watering.
I did it!
He screamed to the mountains.
I did it! I killed the last American eagle!
The earth below him cracked.